Hello and welcome back to another episode of Kerbal Space Program, and welcome back to Realism Progression 1, Realism Overhaul, and Real Solar System. In the last episode, we were able to complete one of the first major contracts, and that is to go 3,000 kilometers downrange. Very difficult, but we eventually were able to succeed, and we learned some lessons along the way that we're going to try to apply towards today's mission, and that's just to go just a little bit farther at 4,500 kilometers downrange. So as always, we're going to be starting off at the KSC, and we don't have very much science to spend, so we're not going to do that. We don't have any projects in the queue at the moment, so let's go ahead and take a look at our mission over here in Mission Control. So early rocket development, we've done a couple of those. Now we have the capstone, which is the final contract of this program that we must complete. And not only do we have to go 4,500 kilometers downrange, but we also have to bring some sounding payload with us. And so that's going to add its own challenge that we have not attempted yet. Because we've been able to get our avionics downrange, but carrying extra weight is going to require some extra forethought. So here we are, we're just going to start off with a blank slate. We're going to create a lift vehicle that can handle it. So we go ahead and we put on the A4 engine and immediately upgrade it to the A9. And once again, we are going to be working on creating a shroud for the engine. However, instead of it being a fairing, we're going to utilize even more tank to utilize that space. So it won't be as long of a rocket because we're putting fuel in this bottom section as well. And we're going to turn it to the highest technology of materials that we have. And for the A9, as well as the A4, you don't need high pressured tank for it, and that's important. So if you find yourself struggling on this contract or the last contract, and you're using high pressured tank for the lower engine, go ahead and change that to a regular tank, and you might be surprised to see it work well. Okay, so now we are going to be putting our avionics and our sounding payload inside a fairing for now. This is an optional step. You don't have to do this. In fact, a lot of people will say that you shouldn't do this. You shouldn't put your avionics into a fairing, that all it is doing is adding extra weight and everything. However, I was testing this often, and under many different attempts, I found that having the fairing was enough to keep the avionics alive long enough to reach its destination, and without the fairings it would blow up long before it could get far enough. So while on one hand, yes, you could do it without the fairings, that many people have done this contract without fairings, for some reason when I kept attempting, I didn't have success until I used the fairings. So do with that what you will. So here we are, we're ready to accept the contract. And we want to accept the contract before we start testing, so that way we can have the contract parameters accessible while we're doing our test. So accepted the contract. And here I have the Kerbal commandments that I had been typing up recently, and I have a couple more that I want to add. The first one being remember the redundancy, and that is going to be very important once we start going into later stages and orbital rockets and whatnot. Number 6 is do the do, and that is because every launch will provide research and information about the parts, and even if it's an unsuccessful launch, we'll learn some things along the way. And then lastly is control what you can and plan for what you cannot. And it's more just to sound cool, I guess. Because there's not really much at this point where we're at right now that we can plan for our failures. But later on, that'll be important. So there we are. We threw a clamshell fairing on the top, makes it look nice and neat. And let's go ahead and work on some control surfaces. Now once again, we only need to have the center of lift slightly below the center of mass, because once the tank starts draining, the center of mass is going to raise up higher. But we want to kind of utilize as much of this wing space without wasting any as possible. So we're going to aim for putting the wings, putting the center of lift just ever so slightly underneath the center of mass without wasting too much space. We also utilize these wings as fuel tanks, so these winglets are going to carry a little bit of fuel in them, which helps add weight to bring the center of mass towards the bottom. And as you see here, our center of lift, the blue circle, is just ever so slightly below the yellow circle, and that's perfect because we're not wasting any costs or materials, just using exactly what we need. Now here I am playing with one of the modular launch pads. I've never quite gotten a lot of practice with it, so I'm kind of just tooling around seeing what I can do with each thing. Doing a little coloring, it's nice. I enjoy the way that these look, so hopefully I can make some use out of them. And we're gonna put the name of the rocket on this side. This is the Downrange 500, and that's because it's carrying 500 liters of sounding payload. But of course we don't need 500 liters, we only need 50 liters. It was a mistake on my part to read it incorrectly. So now we're just gonna tool down our sounding payload to be the right size, and we're gonna name it appropriately. So it's now the Downrange 50. Alright, and so after another test, we decided to revisit this launch system and figure out a better way of doing this. So we are going to go back to our LV2 Aero B3, and we're going to try to adjust it a little bit. So first off, we're going to try to get rid of that fairing. We're going to see if we can do it without the fairing and see how that's going to work out. So after playing around with the conventional tank, I go ahead and change, or the modular tanks, I go ahead and change back to the procedural tanks. So we're going to go ahead and name this the Aero B4 since it's got a different payload. And it's still going to be the LV2 because that is so far has been unchanged. We're going to move these spin motors to be a little more close to the center of mass to give it a more accurate spin. And now we have to adjust these wings so that way once again the center of lift is below the center of mass. And let's go ahead and do a test flight. So now this was a good test flight, but it could be a little bit better, so I decided I'm going to try switching out our Aerojet for the Nike. I've never used the Nike before, so this is throwing something at the wall, seeing if it works. So there, we made sure that our sounding payload was loaded. We're going to adjust our size of our tanks just a little bit. Didn't like the adjustment that I made, so I just went ahead and reloaded the same rocket. And check my staging. And let's go ahead and simulate one more time. So first off, we're going to change the shape of this because it doesn't need to be as aerodynamic as we have been making it. And then we're going to give it a little bit more electric charge. I'm going to make sure that the sounding payload has enough room. And once again, we're going to put the fairing back on. There we go. Puts a little bulb at the top. And check our staging. And let's test once more. Testing always, often. So now we need a little more oomph from this rocket. It's doing okay for the 3,000 kilometer downrange, but this is not getting anywhere near enough for the 4,000. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add some side boosters, and we're going to use the A4s, which is the downgraded version of the A9, which we're using in the center. And that is because the A4s have a smaller burn time to them. So that means that we can be guaranteed that these boosters will drop off before the center one, maximizing their utilization. We could have put 2 A9s on here, but then the center rocket would end at the same time as the side boosters, and at that point we don't really need to use side boosters. We could have just doubled the size of the lifting vehicle, so we're not going to do that. Alright, so we've got it out of the fairing once again. I'm going back and forth on whether or not we want that, because once again during this time we were talking to people online and everybody was telling us that fairings were useless, so I was trying not to use them, but I kept finding them useful. So there we go. Once again, another relatively successful test flight, but not successful enough that we feel comfortable enough just launching them. So let's change the control mass now that it's a much bigger rocket. And let's go ahead and try that again. So we are rounding in on the correct build. We are getting close. Each iteration brings us closer and closer to a successful result. So now, I believe that this rocket is going to be able to get us to where we need to go. So I believe that it's ready to be tooled. And we're going to, of course, need to build a new launch complex for this, because the launch complex that launched the B3 LV2 was, I mean, first of all, it doesn't have the width. We just added side boosters on, so if nothing else, even if it wasn't an extra 20 tons on this rocket, we would need to change the width of it. But because, of course, it's 20 tons extra weight, we're going to have to change the entirety of it, which is going to make this a very expensive launch complex. However, we are now getting into larger launch vehicles, and so this is just going to be the start of the launch complexes that we're going to need to make. And I'm just adding a few extra numbers on each of these to give it a little extra room, which I don't think I should have done. I don't think I needed to do. I should have just made it exactly fit this one, because we're going to start changing our design soon. And there was no need to future-proof that. Alright, so now I've got our launch complex made, but I'm going to increase the priority of it. I want this thing built faster. I'm tired of spending all this extra time just waiting for stuff to be built and research. So I'm going to go in here into our staff, and we are going to just aggressively start hiring people. So let's warp to the completion of the launch complex, and then we're going to fully staff it. Alright, so let's go ahead and add this rocket to the launch pad. However, at the last minute, I decided to take off the Nike and once again put the Aerojet back on. So yeah, so now our timelines of when these rockets are going to appear is not ideal. So let's go ahead and take all these engineers off that launch complex and add them to the new one, and that will drastically increase the build time. We're gonna hire on some more because we have the funds to do it, and by increasing our launch complex, like I said before, it will make our rockets come out faster, which means that we can do more contracts within the timeline that we need to, which means that we can make more money, which means then that we can hire more people, launch better rockets, so on and so forth. So now we're going to come in here because we don't have anything researched, and we're just going to start working on X-planes because we don't have very much science to unlock anything else, and we want our scientists to be doing something. You know, we don't want them just sitting around. So I have them researching X-planes. I may end up changing my mind about that later, but for now we just want them to be doing something. So here we are. Our rocket is officially rolled out, and this is a real launch, not a simulation. And we are going to attempt to make it 4,500 kilometers downrange. So we had a clean separation. I skipped ahead a little bit to when we started our gravity turn. We're going to follow this for a while and see how MechJeb's Ascent Guidance handles a gravity turn like this. Starting to come through the cloud layer. I really wanted to get BlackRack's volumetric clouds to work in RP1, but sadly every time that I tried I ended up running into problems, or the mod wouldn't load itself, and I wanted to bring that to the series, but I could not, and so I decided to just run without it. It'd be worthwhile to just go with the stock visuals, or not stock, but the intended visuals from the RP1 Express install. One of the parts of this contract is that we need to maintain avionics control for the first 50 seconds. I forgot to mention that, but since our main lifting vehicle burns for 115 seconds, we will have no problem completing that part of the contract. Another thing I want to mention is I didn't do this in the last episode, but from this episode going forward, I'm probably going to have this graph that you see here in the bottom right that is charting our surface speed, our velocity, our stages, our mass, all of that different pieces of information that we can look at and just keep an eye on. I found fairly helpful. I'm still learning, seeing what it is that I'm seeing, trying to understand that. But I've enjoyed having the access to the information there. And I think by at least having access to the information to understand, we can utilize that information to make better launches. So let's skip forward a little bit, closer to the time of the engine flame out for our side boosters. And our gravity turn was a little more aggressive than it should have been. We are at 3,200 kilometers, and we are already pitched over farther than 45 degrees. And you should be about 45 degrees when you hit 40,000 kilometers, 40,000 meters. Excuse me. And as you see from our graph, we had hit our first stage, or our fifth stage, excuse me. And there's that little line there that divides the graph to show you that a stage has happened. And you can see now that our upwards trajectory has changed on a lot of these things, and our mass has changed, our surface speed has changed, all of this stuff. And so we now have a better idea of what each stage can perform as. So once again, we're going to skip ahead a little bit, and we are now at the point where we are going to be spin stabilizing our rocket. We do have those spin motors, which will help, but if we could get it started before the actual separation goes, that'll just do it even better. And the reason why we want, I don't think I ever mentioned this, but the reason why we want spin stabilization is that the upper stage of the rocket is unguided. We won't be able to use SAS, or we won't be able to pitch it over or control it in any way. And by spinning it before launching it, we will keep it pointed in the right direction, utilizing that momentum of the spin to keep it steady. Get a little bit of wobbling going. And then with the flame out, MechJeb automatically stages it, but our aerojet does not fire. Our aerojet fails, which means that our Aero B is going to fail. Our AJ-10, excuse me. And so we had ullage in the lines, fuel vapors in the lines, and it did not fire. So this is mostly a failed launch. However, as we noted beforehand, before we even started this, when we were working on the commandments, is that we must always do the do. And what that means is that we build up information, we build up research about our engines, about our different pieces, and with that, they become more reliable with each launch. If I were to have scrubbed this launch and started from the beginning, sure, we could have possibly succeeded. We could have changed that, but we would have missed out on two things. And one, that is the DU, which is our information about the engines, that will ultimately make them more reliable the higher that we have that. So that's part of this launch. And the other part of this launch is that we are also gaining science as this avionics unit does its experiments going through the atmosphere and through space. So we are going to accept this failure. We are going to allow this rocket to explode, and then we are going to go straight back to the science center and launch another one. Because even our failures teach us something. So let's go ahead and set up another rocket for this. So now the time has fast forwarded a little bit because, again, it took time to build this rocket. Alright, got my graph set up, got my autopilot on, and let's get ready to launch. Unfortunately, it was a fairly clear day when we decided to do our second launch, and so we don't really have too much of a cloud layer to break through this time. And just like before, we're steadily pushing up using MechJeb's auto ascent guidance. Eventually, we're gonna start. So we're gonna stop leaning on ascent guidance, and we're gonna start using smart ASS to control our rockets instead, a little more manually. Still slightly automatically, but closer to manual than the ascent guidance. And then once again, we're going to just go ahead and skip forward a little bit until we are ready to stage our side boosters. And then as they flame out, we go ahead and hit the space bar. And now we can physics warp while we do this. We have the ability of physics warping and letting the engine run the entire time and basically burning a lot faster. We could save a lot of time by doing that. However, we also run the risk of having the launch run into some sort of failure, either with the engine or just flipping around, being uncontrolled because it's physics warping. So when we do these real tests, we can't. We just have to sit through the length of it. So as you saw there, most of our wings exploded due to aero forces and whatnot. And there goes our last one. But thankfully, we are actually almost completely out of the atmosphere at this point. So we don't have to worry about very much in the way of aerodynamics. So here we are, our Aerojet performed nominally. Our spin stabilization motors also performed nominally. And then with a clean separation and no ullage problems, our aerobee fires, and we are on our way. So now, once again, the goal is for distance as opposed to height. We still have to make it into space at 140 kilometers, but the most important thing is that we get distance on this launch. And so in trying to do that, we need to have a very horizontal angle of attack, because that will get us the most bang for our buck going forward. So skipping ahead just a little bit, because the AJ-10 has a fairly long burn. As you see, the spin stabilization worked out very well. We are pointed very, very close to our prograde. Basically spinning around the inside of that circle, as opposed to spinning around wobbling on the outside of that circle. So our engine cut off. We're going to let it coast just a little bit before separating. We physics warps, but things start spinning wildly, and I'm worried that it's going to just rip itself apart. So I decide to separate it before physics warping again. But even the physics warp there was threatening to rip the avionics from the sounding payload. So I decided to kill the physics warp for now and just watch it rotate. We're only at 123 kilometers, so it's not going to be long before we're in space, and then we can stop using physics warp and start using time warp, which is just a little bit safer. If you notice on the graph at the bottom, there is a very shaky triangular yellow line, and that is our pitch. So it's fun to watch. It's a good idea to watch your pitch on your ascent, but it's also fun to watch the pitch on the way down, because that line is about to just start going all wacky. So 130 kilometers. Getting close. And now, thankfully for this launch, I didn't put it in a fairing. So you can see exactly what everybody was telling me, is that you don't necessarily need a fairing. For our 3,000 kilometers downrange, for some reason I was having so much trouble without the fairing that the fairing was the successful, what made the mission successful. So I feel that go ahead and understand that you may not need a fairing, but if you're running into problems where your avionics are exploding before they can even reach the distance, then consider putting a fairing, because it will just extend your life a little bit. There we are. So now we're in space, so we can actually time warp our way downrange. That graph is looking fun as it's going along. And once again, we hit 140, so we are no longer able to time warp, only physics warp. We're going to physics warp just a little bit, even though it makes the craft a little wonky. And we take a look at our contract, and before we know it, it has been solved. It's been completed. We have made it 4,500 kilometers downrange, and we still haven't even burnt up in our atmosphere. We made this with plenty of room to spare. So that is good, because we have a few more contracts which will require us to go downrange for some extra money. They're optional contracts, but we can pick those up very confidently now, because we went well over 4,500 kilometers, excuse me. And since we still have science going, we might as well let it go for as long as possible, sending back as much science as possible. And before long, it goes ahead and burns up. Well, anyways, that's where I'm going to leave today's episode. Thank you so much. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you're looking forward for more RP1. If you did, please consider giving me a like, drop me a comment, let me know your thoughts, and I will see y'all in the next one. Take care.